Hello, and welcome to the 2021 San Diego Union-Tribune's Virtual Festival of Books, and welcome to today's panel called Where Fact Meets Fiction, Creating Stories Out of Personal Experiences. I'm Dana Sanchez, a youth services librarian with the San Diego Public Library, and with me today are not one, not two, but three highly acclaimed and award-winning authors here to discuss their recent publications. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anton Treuer, author of 19 books, including Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, and a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University. Dr. Treuer has received more than 40 prestigious awards and fellowships, including ones from the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and more. And he also serves on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society. In 2018, he was named Guardian of Culture and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Welcome, Anton.
Thanks so much for having me.
Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Nayeri, author of several books, including Everything Sad is Untrue, A True Story, which was awarded the 2021 Michael L. Prince Award for Outstanding Young Adult Literature, and was named one of the best books of the year by NPR, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. He is known for being a charismatic public speaker, acting as a guest speaker at many book festivals across the country, and his narration of the audiobook version of Everything Sad is Untrue, A True Story also received an Audi Finalist Medal for his outstanding narration. Daniel was born in Iran and spent a couple of years as a refugee before immigrating to Oklahoma at age 8 with his mother and sister. He now lives with his family in New Jersey. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Margarita Engel, a Cuban-American author of many books, including the verse novels Your Heart, My Sky, With a Star in My Hand, The Surrender Tree, which was a Newbery Honor winner, and The Lightning Dreamer. Her verse memoirs include Soaring Earth and Enchanted Air, which received the Pura Belpré Award, a Walter Dean Myers Award honor, and was a finalist for the YALSA Award for Excellence in Nonfiction. Margarita also served as the 2017 to 2019 Young People's Poet Laureate. She was born in Los Angeles, California, and developed a deep attachment to her mother's homeland during childhood summer visits to Cuba. And she now lives in Central California with her husband. Welcome, Margarita.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's get started. So all three of your most recent publications create stories out of personal and cultural histories, both for better and for worse. I'd like to begin with asking each of you to briefly describe your book and tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write these stories. Anton, let's start with you. Please tell us about Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, and what inspired you to write it.
You know, I kind of stumbled into this book project by accident. I grew up in northern Minnesota on and next to the Leech Lake Reservation, which is one of the reservations there. Went to school in a place that's sometimes called a border town. You know, maybe 25% of the town's native, maybe half of the shopping population. And I had so many clunky and uncomfortable experiences around race and so forth that by the time I'd finished high school, my goal was to leave town and never come back. And I thought somehow that there was a way to escape the brambled racial borderland of my youth by going somewhere else. I ended up where Daniel's living now in New Jersey, going to Princeton University. And the brambled racial borderland just followed me everywhere I went. I remember the first question there, I thought, oh, these are going to be really smart people, well educated, they'll know something. And, the first things are like, where's your tomahawk or whatever. And, sometimes comical, sometimes painful. And at one point I was getting really homesick. There's nothing like leaving home to make you appreciate where you just left. And I heard there was this woman, this Comanche spiritual leader, coming to New Jersey to run sweat lodge ceremonies. And I'm a little naive, but I thought, well, if it's anything like home, I'll go check it out, knowing there are Fruit Loops and charlatans and all that out there. And lo and behold, there were like 20 white folk waiting to go into the sweat lodge ceremony at maybe 4 p.m, broad daylight, and they're all naked. And I remember driving up, and part of me is thinking, I really wanted to laugh, because what can you do? There's 20 naked people standing around in the woods. Part of me wanted to run, because dang, there's 20 naked people standing around in the woods. And, and part of me was really mad, like, dang, is that what they think we're all about? And then being naive, I get out of the car and I'm folded into a tight embrace by one of these naked strangers who's hugging me and saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. So now awkward, the desire to like laugh, run, get mad is growing. And then I looked at this woman's face. She was an elder. There are tears welling up in her eyes. And I could tell that no matter how misguided she was, and she was misguided, that her emotive response was real. And if I just walked away, she'd keep thinking what she's thinking. And if I just got mad and told her off, no matter how self-righteous I felt, that would just probably hurt and dehumanize both of us. And so I had to think fast, and I said, could you put some clothes on? Because I would love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we had a good talk. And I came to the realization, I guess we could have called the book, Lessons from a Naked Stranger in the New Jersey Woods, that ultimately it's important to make safe space, not just to call out, but to call people in, to try to provide meaningful answers, not just angry rebukes. And that the personal narrative, the lived experience, the relatable story are the most engaging ways to connect people to information, to a challenge to our prevailing assumptions. We should all give all the folks we want to give a good talking to, a good listening to. And I just started saving up the questions, because natives, we are so often imagined and so infrequently well understood. And went out searching for the answers that sometimes I experienced through my own lived experience as a Native person, and sometimes even resentfully felt like, why didn't anybody ever teach me about this before? And through the course of that, I feel like I was transformed, but it's been a great honor to engage with so many other people and their learning and transformation too. It's been great.
Thank you. Yeah, there are so many great thought-provoking questions in this book, and I really think that readers will appreciate your personal touch in there as well, and those personal stories, including the one that you just told. One of my personal favorites is the question, where are the real Indians? And your personal story behind being asked that question while lecturing in France. I found it both amusing and unfortunate. Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Anton. Daniel, your book also includes personal stories, as well as weaving in the ancient art of traditional Persian storytelling. Please tell us about your book, Everything Sad is Untrue, A True Story, and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. So yeah, this is the book. It's autobiographical, and what inspired me to write it is always such a difficult question that I sort of take sideways, because I've been wanting to write the story forever. What inspired it, I guess, was the living where I came to the United States when I was around second grade. And, we had very little English. So it was sort of like, and there were no ESL programs at the time. So, or maybe there were, they just weren't in the school I was attending. And so, you just sort of get thrown into it. And the first question anybody wants to ask, no matter where you go, whatever you do, is sort of like, what are you doing here? And they come at it in these, awkward ways. But that's sort of the question you have to answer. And I, over the years, would come up with all kinds of different answers. They were all sort of true, but they were just sort of like, this one's the fast one. This one's the, I want to get to, I want to just get to the meal part. So, and this one's the one I really want to, tell the whole thing and make it sound like an action story. And I started to tell and retell the story, thousands of times. And I sort of credit that for my love of not only storytelling, but of like breaking forms and trying to tell stories in different ways. Some of my favorite writers are people who are, thought of as pretty experimental in their way. And so that was where the love of it came. The inspiration of it is fundamentally, when I talk to kids, I'm sort of like, I sort of feel like I had this mom who could leap tall buildings in a single bound. And if you have that, you're kind of like bound to tell the story. You have to tell this kind of experience of watching her do this really quickly. What happened was, she converted to Christianity in Iran when I was a young kid and joined the secret or the underground church. It's a capital crime to have done that. So, colloquially here we say she had a fatwa on her head because we've heard, that phrase. Fatwa just means law. So it makes some sense. But the idea being here that, she had committed a crime of apostasy. And so we had to leave the country very quickly. And went first to the UAE and then to a refugee camp in the outskirts of Rome in a town called Mentana, and then to Oklahoma. And so the story begins with the narrator standing in front of a classroom full of kids who've just explained what they did, over the summer. And he's trying to explain, well, we just got here, and, and he's trying to explain his whole life. And he finds himself in this awkward position that he ascribes to, or at least he sort of compares to the, Scheherazade, the great storyteller of my culture, is, if quickly with her in the 1001 Nights, she's telling a story every night to murder his king, and he's going to kill her in the morning. And so she tells the story in such a way that it always ends on a cliffhanger, and he's always, dying to see the rest or hear the rest. And so he spares her for one more night. So the ultimate skeptical audience, so to speak. So he's standing in front of a room full of classmates, also quite skeptical, and he kind of compares that life or death situation to his social life or death situation. And in order to tell that story, he realizes that he's got to keep going back, right? He's like, well, we're refugees. And it's like, okay, well, you have to explain what refugees are. And then you have to explain why you're refugees and why that's a crime in the first place, and why that, why sort of the cultures are the way they are, and the history of his culture and the history of his family, and why this all happened. And so he just keeps having to go further and further and further back until you get to basically, the history of the Iranian, at the time, the Persian Empire. And so, so it's kind of one of those, the structure of the story is one of those wherein he keeps trying to accommodate the audience by explaining further, but in order to do that, he has to keep delivering more and more of the history. So it in a lot of ways, it parallels the Arabian Nights, this sort of constant, oration that goes on, and then this sort of always in a meta oration with, like telling the story, but always being aware of that you're telling the story because the audience's reaction is so important. And so always trying to manage the audience at the same time as telling the story. That's basically where it came from.
Oh yeah, and I love how you just effortlessly blend the autobiographical, because Khosrow, the main character, is you,
right.
with those traditional Persian myths and stories of Scheherazade, 1001 Nights. I really appreciated. It was just so effortless, and there were no chapters.
I appreciate that you would say
that. It all went perfectly together, and I feel like readers can really see and feel your love of storytelling and your connection to Persian culture through that. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next, Margarita, your story can be considered historical fiction, but it has its roots in the very real struggles and experiences of some of your family members in Cuba. Please tell us about your book, Your Heart, My Sky, and the inspiration behind it.
Thank you. Well, yes, it is very personal. Whenever I visit Cuba, I'm always sad, or Miami, I'm always saddened by the way relatives still reminisce about the trauma of waking up hungry throughout the 90s, waking up to nothing but sugar water. And I started visiting Cuba again as an adult in 1991. During the Pan American Games, it was possible suddenly for the first time in 31 years. My last trip had been in 1960 as a child. And after that, the travel restrictions from both sides just made it impossible. So there was this gap in my life, this before and after, where I needed to go back. I needed to see the relatives I hadn't seen for so long. During the Pan American Games in 1991, the Cuban people had been told not to talk to anybody from outside. So not to talk to the outsiders who had come to the games. They wanted the tourism, they wanted the money, but they didn't want the influence of outside ideas. So I visited my relatives in secret. And the first thing every one of them did, they recognized me. They hadn't seen me since I was 9 years old. And they recognized me from photographs that my grandmother had been sending from Miami all those years. So they had my wedding pictures and pictures of my babies in their homes. But the first thing they would do is open the refrigerator to show me that there was nothing in it. I would offer you something. There was always water, boiled water, and that was it. So I kept going back and forth throughout the 90s with suitcases with food and vitamins and books. They wanted to read Animal Farm. They wanted to read the poetry of Octavio Paz, who was banned in Cuba because he had said bad things about a certain guy with a certain beard. And not because of his poetry, but something he said in passing in an interview. So it was a very different experience. I wrote about it at the time. I wrote about the hunger. And nobody cared. In the US, nobody cared. I would do this public speaking, talking about it, and nobody cared. And I spoke in other parts of Latin America at book festivals. And not only did people in other parts of Latin America not care, they were actively hostile to me because they wanted to hold Cuba up as an ideal. They were stuck in 1959 when somebody had stood up to the US and to a right-wing dictator, Batista, and they wanted to think of that as heroism, even though it was extremely repressive and people suffered and still suffer an extreme lack of freedom of expression. So I'll bring it up. On July 11th, last week, there were protests not seen since 1994. The ones in 1994 were protests because of the hunger, but they were also protests because of lack of freedom of expression. The rafter crisis of the 90s, where tens of thousands of Cubans drowned trying to reach Florida, was because of hunger, and it was also because of the lack of freedom of expression. On July 11th this year, the word people were shouting was libertad, freedom. I think we should listen to them. They need food. They also need freedom of expression. And I tried to show both of those things in this book. Now, That period was called El Periodo Especial en Tiempos de Paz. The government said this is a special period in times of peace where you are going to have to make warlike sacrifices, as if it were wartime. So it was a euphemism. Many of my cousins stayed. Some left on rafts. Some left on rafts while I was in their home. And so I experienced this in a very personal way. I had a survivor's guilt because my U.S. passport just allowed me to come in and out of that suffering freely, you know, without really sharing it. I wrote Your Heart, My Sky for young people, and I'm hoping that they'll care more than the adults did while it was happening in the 90s. It's a love story about a girl and a boy who are suffering this hunger, and yet even in times, no matter what's happening in the world, people still fall in love. Mm-hmm. So it's a love story. There is a Cupid in the love story, and the Cupid is a singing dog. It's one of the indigenous Taino dogs that were similar to the singing dogs of New Guinea. And I think there's some in Louisiana. They howl instead of barking. So the dog leads them to food and to each other. And it's really a book, in a way, it's a STEM book. It's a science book too, because it's about rediscovering farming. You know, what do you do when your government just completely fails to feed you, to make food available? All the farms are collectivized. Especially at that time, there are some small independent farms now, but at the time in the 90s, they were all collectivized. All food belonged to the government. A farmer who was raising cattle would be sentenced to 30 years in prison if he killed a cow and ate it. You know, killed a cow for his family. Eating bananas that grew along the roadside was a crime because they belonged to the government. So there are things that are hard for us to imagine because it was such a different set of rules. But there were people learning to farm in secret. There were people with pigs in their bathtubs and plants on their rooftops, trying to rediscover farming, the wisdom of their grandfathers, which had been lost. I write all my books now in poetry. I wrote it in poetry. The subtitle, I don't know if you can see, the subtitle is Love in a Time of Hunger. And the title, Your Heart, My Sky, comes from a Jose Marti poem. And I write in poetry. People always ask why. And the answer, as a scientist, I was trained as a botanist and agronomist. I always used to try and think of real complicated answers, scientific, break it down into its components. Why do I write in poetry? The answer is actually very simple. Poetry makes me happy. Poetry is music, and poetry has rhythm. And it's very easy for me to come out of a poem, no matter how sad the story, feeling hopeful. It's a connection to peace, perseverance, and hope.
Thank you for that description of your experiences and of your book. While reading it, I was shocked to learn about this time in Cuban history that I had never learned about. Granted, I was very young at the time, but still, even today, with what we've seen recently happening, still have not heard of it in that context. And I believe that these stories continue to be relevant today and are worthy of being told. So thank you. And you already answered my next question, which is about the unique formats of all three of your works. Anton, your work is comprised of over 100 different questions on a variety of different topics, ranging from history and language to politics and social activism. What do you think are some of the advantages of formatting your book this way, especially when keeping young adult readers in mind?
Yeah, among the hats I wear is I'm the father of 9 children. So I field test everything I do on these kids. And, I would have them read passages back to me or read things to them, and I could tell if there was something disengaging or if something they thought was funny or what have you. And I think the advantage of formulating the book this way is that it's really adaptable for schools and for kids. You can focus on what you're interested in. You don't have to commit to, hundreds of pages. You can take sections and proceed without, getting lost in all of it. But at the same time, there's a great breadth of information. And frankly, kids are so curious and are hungry for information, and also super smart. Like, they know the world's a messed up place and the adults have a really hard time getting their act together. And they're looking for this, like, what can I do to help? How can we make the world a better place? Why am I not getting this information? And things like that. And so I think it just provides a great way for them to do that that's relevant and relatable.
Absolutely. Yeah, I personally really enjoyed the question and answer format and found it to be very user-friendly and easy to reference back to for both non-natives like myself and natives. I can see them referencing it back in that way that you just described. And I also think that your candid responses and honest answers really go a long way with young adult readers who usually really appreciate frankness and authenticity. So thank you for that. Daniel, you are also quite straightforward in telling your story, which, as I mentioned, is a beautiful combination of traditional Persian storytelling and personal histories, both as a young child in Iran and as a teenager in Oklahoma. How did you approach blending these two aspects together in your story? I know you already kind of mentioned a little bit about that, but if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So the structure is sort of it's one massive stream of words and has no breaks. There are no chapters. There are no chapter breaks. He sort of gets a hold of you and doesn't stop. And the reason I went for that was, I suppose, I mean, it's a function of sort of anxiety that you'll see in kids like this that I wanted to show rather than tell, right? But what happens, when you have and this also goes back to like the meta I was talking about, where he's telling the story but always watching himself tell the story and watching you listen to him, and he's always trying to gauge. I mean, he can't see you obviously, but he's trying to gauge not only your interest level but whether or not you believe him, and then he's trying to like counter that. He's like, this seems unbelievable, I know, but let me make it more believable by telling you this other thing. And so and the reason for that is kind of this particular experience that happens when you're a refugee, which is before they let you into the country, you go to all these embassies, right? Like, the life of a refugee is basically you're homeless. That's what it is. You're the global homeless. You've gotten out of wherever it is that you've gotten out of. And that place is usually your home country, and you're no longer a citizen of that country because by definition that they're trying to kill you, right? By definition, you're someone who's in direct danger. And this can happen because of like civil war, various strife, genocide, like just stuff, awful stuff. And so at that point, you don't have paperwork, or you don't have official paperwork because it's all been revoked. and you don't have anything to the places you're going. So what you're doing is you're holding up somewhere, which is where you hear phrases like refugee camp. It doesn't always mean tent cities, although usually it does. It means really just like a holding facility, a holding place, where you're where you're basically, that's where you're sleeping, and you don't have a job, you're illegal, and you don't know what to do. And so functionally, what you're doing with your time is you're going to all the different embassies in the country you happen to be in, for all the various other countries, and you're interviewing, and you're assessing, and they're assessing like who they want to let in. And who knows? I mean, it's a highly complicated set of reasons why people are let in and aren't. But fundamentally, when you're a little kid, you're not watching for those. You're just realizing that you're walking in the store, you're waiting with 200 other people in a lobby. There's a person behind that glass. They don't look happy. The person before that went just would not get his papers out of his satchel fast enough and was annoying the crud out of that person. And you're watching their faces, just like hoping you get a non-annoyed one, hoping that like, what funny human thing can you do to make them crack a smile, because that's going to get you a better shot. As a kid, probably that doesn't matter. I'm still an adult who thinks that stuff matters. But I assume other adults don't. I don't know. But as a kid, you definitely think it matters. You are in there hoping to charm. You're in there hoping to say things properly. And so when they turn to you, you'll often be coached not to lie, or even not to say things in a way that makes it seem like you're hiding anything, which is the harder note to follow, because you'll be in there and you'll very quickly realize that you're under suspicion, whatever that suspicion might be. Sometimes the suspicion is that this person isn't your parent. They've kidnapped you, or sometimes the suspicion is that you're there for some, some nefarious reason. And so you're just trying to look like a good person, and you're trying to look honest, and you're trying to answer questions in the most precise way you can. So the example I often give is like the benign and really banal question of like, did you come here alone? Which they'll ask because they're trying to assess, who you met with. And you'll be like, yes, no, because I came with my parents. That's my mother. I came with my mother. I walked through this door with my mother and my sister. There was a man who opened the door for us, but we weren't with him. We came together. So there's three of us. We came alone otherwise. And you'll answer this question, and you just watch yourself like implode into like answers, and then revisions and revisions and revisions. And every revision you're panicking further. And this is sort of what he's doing. In the story, he's clearly obviously not. That scene never gets shown. It kind of gets alluded to, but the mode with which this kid is telling the story is, yeah, we're refugees, but in Oklahoma, and it's like, well, that seems weird. I know that seems weird, but let me explain. And he's constantly trying to. He's treating you like this sort of, embassy, bureaucrat, and trying his hardest to not only charm but seem honest. And if you've ever tried to do that, it's the fastest way to look super suspicious. So that's where his sort of, as a narrator, where he's getting all of this, all of these little quirks and foibles, and once you sort of do that, you kind of you can't turn the spigot off. He's just trying to get a hold of you until he's satisfied that you believe him, you think he's a human being, you think he's telling the truth, and it takes some 400 pages before he's told you the whole thing, and then he lets go. So that was where the structure.
Yeah. And I actually listened to the audiobook version first before I got my hands on a physical copy. I loved that you were the narrator, by the way. And I really got that feeling of, he's grabbing on to me and not wanting to let go. He's wanting to make me believe what the story that he's telling. So absolutely that format. And so I didn't know that there weren't chapters until I got my hold on the book, and I was like, oh, okay. What comes off as maybe rambling, but in a good way, you know, a tangents. It all made sense, you know, once I got my hands on that book. So I loved it. And your narration really allowed your sense of humor and sarcasm to shine.
Thank you.
Really appreciated that.
Thanks very much.
Very good. All right. And Margarita, you already told us about why you chose novels in verse, and I think that's a perfectly succinct explanation of why, because you love it. And I also think that novels in verse can really it makes the characters more vulnerable, and it allows particularly young adults and middle grade readers to relate more one-on-one. You're hearing those inner thoughts of those characters, and so it allows those young readers to really get in those characters' shoes.
Thank you. I tried to make it very immediate. Even my memoir was written in first person and present tense, which someone could argue, can a memoir be in present tense? You know, am I a kid again? But yes, I am still a kid inside. So yes, anything can be first person and present tense. And I think that makes poetry, free verse, very immediate. It's also interactive. These spaces between stanzas and spaces between lines, all those breaks. I never like it when people call them empty. I believe that they're filled with the echoes of what has just been said, and that they're filled with the reader's emotions as well as the poet's emotions. And those spaces are where our emotions meet in midair. And I hope that young people will feel free to write their own verses in response to anything I've written. If there's a missing voice in the story, if they say, hey, but what about his best friend? Or, you know, his little brother didn't have a voice or something like that, well, jump in there and write it. And I also feel like those echoes are important. They're a resonance. Like after you ring a bell, that vibration continues for a long time. It is music.
So beautifully said, like a poet. Yeah, those spaces are definitely not empty. They are filled with the echoes of the voices that are telling those stories and mixing with the thoughts and emotions of the reader. Beautifully said. Thank you for that.
Well, I'd like to take just one tiny moment to quote my very favorite poem by a Cuban poet, Dulce Maria Loinaz. En mi verso soy libre. In my verse, I am free. I said that poetry makes me happy, and that's why.
Yes, happy and free. Thank you. Well, speaking of powerful and quotes, Anton, you alluded earlier in our conversation to a quote with one of my favorites in your book is Indians, we are so often imagined, but so infrequently understood. Would you care to elaborate on that statement for us and tell us more about it?
Sure. I think in America, what is distinctive about this place, aside from its physical geography, is the indigenous experience. And America's often imagined us, people for the Boston Tea Party dressed up as natives, dumping tea into the harbor, not because they thought anyone would think they were indigenous, but there was this fantasy that natives are freer than everyone, and we aspire to that, aspirational. And then at the same time that you get the noble savage thing, there's the ignoble one too. But because we're relatively small in terms of the population overall, and in many parts of the country, less visible, like in the Southeast, for example, they all ended up in Oklahoma, through the removal process, then it's easier for people to imagine us and harder to understand. And we have to work at it. And, it occurs to me that all of the authors on this panel are kind of rumbling with, on the one hand, the importance of, cultural continuity, and on the other hand, the right to and the importance of cultural change. And that, we are all of us humans have been displaced out of the way humans have lived through most of human history, but more recently through colonization and so many societal upheavals. I think it's important for us to understand one another, to shine light on the absent narratives, to hold one another up. And, reading, education, travel can be pretty fatal to prejudice. And we all need to do a lot more of that.
Agreed. Absolutely. And when history is so sugar-coated, we're often left with the romanticized versions of what we expect certain people and cultures to be, Native American, Cuban American, Iranian, and I feel your book, really helped to bridge that gap between Native cultures and the rest of the world. Daniel, so your book also has a very great first liner that we could talk about, but I feel like there's a much more pressing question that I think your readers would want me to ask, so I'm going to ask it. What's with all the poop stories?
What's with all the poop stories? It's just writers make metaphors out of everything. It was actually a really salient metaphor. So the book, for the people who haven't, people say there's a lot. First of all, there's a few, and I had to edit like 3 of them out. So let's get real here. Not nearly as many as could have been. But it's the notion. There's several stories around poop that are comedic. But why did I put them in? I put them. There's a highfalutin answer and a sort of a more regular answer. The highfalutin answer, real quickly, is like I used to be a chef. I am very much like food and cuisine is the way I think about not only my culture but everybody else's culture. Frankly, it's the way I interact with my friends. A lot. This isn't particularly extraordinary, but I'm a very food-oriented individual, and I think about that all the time. And in this case, I was thinking about it because Persian food is universally, like, I think as a chef, I think about this all the time because I keep waiting for the great Persian next-gen chef to really take our cuisine into like a high cuisine level by just plating it better. Like, we have really terrible plating. Part of it is because it's rice. Rice is really hard to get a hold of. Forever, people have been doing that ring thing, which is like, whatever. And sometimes they'll put it in bowls, like at a nice Indian restaurant. You get a nice, cute little like container for the rice. And then it's a lot of stews. And then, of course, we got our kebabs. Not great shapes. Like, it's like sushi is just so perfect looking on the noodles. Look perfect on a plate. Anyway, Persian cuisine, in my opinion, for my money, best tasting, of course. It's my family, but looks terrible on a plate. Like, I'll say it first. So I've always had trouble getting people to eat Persian food, and then they eat it, and it's really good, right? So I knew I wanted to talk about Persian food, and I wanted it to be more than a metaphor, more than just like an eating memoir, and so when you think about it, and then the highfalutin part, Rushdie Salman has this really great sequence in Midnight's Children where, and for him, one of the salient metaphors he keeps coming back to is pickling. Of course, pickles are a major part of lots of cuisines, certainly Indian, certainly Persian. And he's talking about pickling as this just like great mixture. You could think of it almost as a stew metaphor, right? Because this is like mixed pickles, right? And they're all coming together. And pickling, of course, is a metaphor for alcoholism, and pickling is a metaphor for all these things for him. And his character is on a train. Salim Sinai is on this train. He's watching, and he's at a train station. And there's this older gentleman that he looks out through the window, makes eye contact, and the old guy is just squatting and defecating right there in public. And there's something in Sinai that like kind of I don't know, reaches out to this guy, the old man who's a bit of a quirky figure starts laughing when he sees them, and he goes, "I used to make them this big," which is kind of a joke about how his own like in this old man's youth, he was sort of he had more vigor and he produced better, and so. That is weirdly enough, like you can write a thesis, and I'm almost certain I wrote an essay on this in university. And so when I was thinking about this, I was just thinking about humanity and what we consume and what we produce, right? At its like most basic level, right? We consume food, we produce poop. And that if you are not a particularly noble individual, that's all you do. That's the sum total of your legacy, and then you die. And yet we are sort of called to something higher. We are called to consuming and producing something more. And when you think about that in the context of my book, it's you have a lot of characters who are consuming a lot of pain. They're taking it in. I don't think that's particularly extraordinary. I think that's going to be life for a lot of people. Is, hey, kid, get prepped. It's going to be hard. Life is hard. And the people who are the characters that are most admired in this book are the ones who sort of take that pain and metabolize it into something other than another generation of pain. You have a character who, in The Stepfather, who you see like takes like has one of the most tragic backstories, has a really abusive father himself, and then sort of becomes one. And here, metaphorically, poetically, whatever you want to call it, is a person who's consuming and producing pain, and that's all they did. And there was no great alchemy happened in their hearts. And then in the mother and in some other figures in the book, you see that they somehow, I don't know, this is the great calling of adulthood or the craft of art or moral goodness. I don't know. This is the question I would ask if I was asking a book club. But whatever it is, she takes in a lot of pain, and somehow she doesn't pass it on. Somehow she, as I said, metastasizes it into love and into better things. And I think this ends up being the calling of art, is to make something beautiful out of these things. And so poop actually ended up being kind of like a metaphor that I vibed with and I liked. I know it sounds both corny and gross, but there you have it. And I liked it, so I went with it. But the food parts, no one ever goes, how come food? Because memoirs are full of food.
Well, I noticed the recurring food theme as well. And I saw the connection between, food is a part of culture, of course. And when you get down to it, how one uses the restroom is also a reflection of one's culture as well, which you have some stories in there too, that go into that as well. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. Well, we could go on for hours. I would love to talk to all three of you more about your works. In the interest of time, I want to ask the three of you one final question. What are you working on next, or what can we look forward to from you? Why don't we start with Margarita first?
I just received the advanced review copy of my next young adult verse novel, Primas Rebellion. And the subtitle is Courage in a Time of Tyranny. It's about Cuba's suffragists during the 1920s and 30s when they were struggling not only for the right for women to vote, but they were struggling against the divorce law, which allowed men to legally kill wives or daughters caught with a lover. And they were struggling for the right to education for illegitimate children. And they were trying to overthrow a dictator, Machado. So they were very busy women, and very brave. And it was a fascinating subject to research. It comes out in February.
Very good. I look forward to seeing it on our shelves. Thank you, Margarita.
I think there's a tendency for people to think of suffrage only in terms of England and the US, but there's a timeline at the end of the book that shows the wide range of years when different countries finally gave women the right to vote. It's hard because women couldn't vote. If women had been able to vote, we would have all gotten the right to vote very quickly.
Right. Exactly. That's the problem. All right. Thank you, Margarita. Anton, what are you working on?
I've got a new one coming out in the fall too. It's called The Cultural Toolbox, Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World. There's a little snap of that one. And of course, top secret projects. I usually wait until they're coming out before I shout them out to the rest of the world.
All right. Can't wait. And Daniel, are you already working on your next?
I am, yeah. It's this one's a historical. I joke around. I'm like, it's The Music Man, set in the 11th century Silk Road. So it's sort of a kind of a comedy buddy picture set in modern day Uzbekistan, along the sort of the most famous, part of this is like gigantic trade route that went from the 4th century to the 11th century. Yeah, it's been fun.
Fascinating. Love that combination there. All right. Well, that concludes our panel on Where Fact Meets Fiction, creating stories out of personal experiences. I'd like to thank the San Diego Union-Tribune and the Festival of Books for inviting us to participate in this incredible panel. And of course, a very big thank you to our authors, Dr. Anton Treuer, author of Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, Daniel Nayeri, author of Everything Sad is Untrue, A True Story, and Margarita Engel, author of Your Heart, My Sky. You can purchase their books from our indie bookseller partners by using the link below. And please consider supporting the San Diego Council on Literacy by visiting literacysandiego.org. Continue to join us today for a full program of author interviews, exciting demonstrations, and fun entertainment streamed entirely online. Videos from the sessions will be made available after the Festival of Books on sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thank you all for joining me. I'm Dana Sanchez, a librarian with the San Diego Public Library. And of course, our authors, Dr. Anton Treuer, Daniel Nayeri, and Margarita Engel. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.